The day Eudora Abbott buried her brother was the same day she became a mother to 3 children who were not her own, and she did not hesitate for even a single breath before she said yes. It was the autumn of 1878, in the dusty, sun-scorched town of Caldwell, Kansas, sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail where cattle drives still thundered through and cowboys still slept under open skies. The town smelled of leather and horse and fresh-cut timber, and it was the kind of place where life moved fast and grief moved faster, because there was always too much work waiting to allow for the luxury of falling apart. Eudora was 26 years old when her brother Thomas died. He had been gored by a longhorn steer on the third day of a cattle drive south of the Cimarron River, and by the time word reached Caldwell, the man himself had already been wrapped in canvas and buried in the Oklahoma Territory soil. His wife, Clara, had succumbed to fever just 8 months before that, leaving Thomas to manage his small homestead and 3 children alone. And now Thomas was gone too, and the children, Nettie, who was 7, Samuel, who was 5, and baby Rosie, who had only just turned 2, were standing in Eudora's narrow kitchen with wide, bewildered eyes and nowhere else to go. Eudora had been living alone since her own circumstances had brought her to Caldwell 2 years prior. She had been briefly promised to a man in Missouri, a promising arrangement that dissolved when it became clear the man was more interested in the small inheritance her father had left her than in Eudora herself. She had packed one trunk, ridden a stagecoach westward, and quietly built herself a life in Caldwell. She took in sewing and mending. She sold preserves and dried herbs at the Saturday market. She kept a tidy house and a small kitchen garden and told herself she was content, which was almost always true. Then came the children, and content became something altogether different. She sold Thomas's homestead for what little it was worth, absorbed the debt that remained, and moved Nettie, Samuel, and Rosie into her 2-room house as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She added a loft above the main room for Nettie and Samuel, and she moved her own bed against the kitchen wall so Rosie could sleep beside her in a cradle she borrowed from the preacher's wife. She learned how to braid little girl hair. She learned how to talk Samuel out of his nightmares. She learned how to nurse a toddler through croup in January with nothing but steam and patience, and the particular kind of steady calm that comes not from certainty, but from the refusal to be defeated. 3 years she had done this. 3 years of stretching every coin until it bent, of patching the same pair of Samuel's trousers 4 times over, of singing Rosie to sleep when her arms ached from the weight of the day. 3 years of school lessons and skinned knees and whispered prayers at the side of 3 small beds every single night. The children called her Aunt Dora, and she let them, because they had lost so much already that changing their language seemed cruel. But in her heart, she knew what she was. She was their mother in every way that counted. The autumn of 1881 arrived with a dry wind off the prairie, and a cattle drive bigger than most anyone in Caldwell had seen in recent memory. The Sutton outfit came rolling into town on a Wednesday afternoon with a herd of 350 longhorns and a trail crew of 12 men, raising such a cloud of red dust that the schoolteacher dismissed class early, and the children poured out into the street to watch the spectacle. Eudora was there too, because she had been on her way back from delivering a basket of mending to Mrs. Hargrove, and the cattle were simply unavoidable. She stood on the low wooden boardwalk in front of Finley's dry goods store with Rosie balanced on her hip and Samuel clutching her skirt, and Nettie standing on her tiptoes trying to see over the heads of taller people. The cowboys rode alongside the herd with practiced ease, calling out to each other and keeping the cattle moving, their voices hoarse from weeks on the trail. They were dust-covered and lean and smelled strongly of horse and sweat, and Eudora had seen enough trail crews come through Caldwell to know not to look at them too long. But then one of the riders pulled his horse away from the herd and stopped not 20 feet from where she stood, and she looked, because Rosie had suddenly shrieked with delight and pointed, and whatever a 2-year-old found thrilling was usually worth seeing. The man on horseback was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more. He was tall even in the saddle, with broad shoulders and a face that the trail had weathered into something angular and honest. His hat was pushed back from his forehead, and when he turned toward the commotion of Rosie's enthusiastic pointing, Eudora saw that his eyes were the particular warm brown of good river water, deep and clear and deceptively calm. He caught her looking. She did not look away fast enough. He touched the brim of his hat in a small, unhurried gesture, and then he was back with the herd, and Eudora told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. The Sutton outfit made camp outside of town for 3 days to rest the cattle and resupply before pushing them north to the stockyards. During those 3 days, the trail crew came into Caldwell in shifts, the way trail crews always did, some men resting while others filled the saloon and the barber shop and the general store. It was ordinary and expected, and Eudora paid it no particular attention. Except that on the first evening, the tall cowboy appeared at the door of Finley's dry goods store just as Eudora was inside purchasing a length of calico and a spool of brown thread. She had Samuel beside her, and was in the middle of explaining to Mr. Finley that she needed the calico cut to precisely 2 yards because she was making Samuel new trousers and could not afford to waste fabric, when the cowboy stepped through the door and removed his hat. He was even taller standing. He had cleaned up some. The worst of the trail dust was gone, and he had shaved the scruff along his jaw, though a day or two of growth remained. He moved through the store with a natural quietness, not the forced quietness of a man trying to seem harmless, but the genuine quietness of someone accustomed to his own company. He gathered a few items: tobacco, a new knife handle, a bar of soap, and came to wait at the counter behind Eudora. Samuel, who had no instinct for social reserve whatsoever, turned around and stared directly at the man with open curiosity. "Your hat has a dent in it," Samuel observed. "Samuel," Eudora said. "It does," the cowboy said, his voice low and carrying an unhurried cadence that placed him somewhere from the hill country of Texas. "Got sat on outside of Wichita. I have been meaning to do something about it." "Aunt Dora could fix it," Samuel said. "She fixes everything." The cowboy's eyes moved from Samuel to Eudora, and there was something in them, not boldness exactly, but an honest kind of interest that was harder to dismiss than boldness would have been. "Is that so?" he said. "He exaggerates," Eudora said, gathering her parcels from Mr. Finley. "I do not," Samuel said, completely sincerely. The cowboy put out his hand to Samuel first, which Eudora noted. "Monroe Sutton," he said, "pleased to meet you." Samuel shook with great seriousness. "Samuel Abbott, this is Aunt Dora." Monroe Sutton turned his hand toward Eudora, and she took it briefly, because she was not rude. His hand was rough and warm and very large around hers. "Miss Abbott," he said. "Mr. Sutton," she returned, and then she guided Samuel toward the door before Samuel could offer any more information about her capabilities or her habits. But she walked home with something she had not carried in a long time, a small, persistent awareness of another person, like a new sound in a familiar room that changes the whole atmosphere of the place. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this again on the second day, when Monroe Sutton appeared at the Saturday market, as she was arranging her jars of blackberry preserves on the cloth-covered table. He was not looking for her, clearly. He was moving through the market with the purposeful stride of a man doing ordinary errands, but he stopped when he saw her table and came over with that same unhurried ease, and he bought 2 jars of preserves without any negotiation, paying exactly what she asked without a word of bargaining. "These are good prices," he said. "They are fair prices," she corrected. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that happened slowly, starting at the corners and working its way across his face. It transformed something in his expression, made the weathered severity of his features into something approachable and real. "Fair," he agreed. "That is a better word." Nettie, who had come to help at the market table that morning, was watching Monroe Sutton with the sharp, assessing gaze of a 10-year-old who had been through enough life to develop opinions about people. "Are you the man from the cattle drive?" Nettie asked. "I am," Monroe said, turning his attention to her with the same directness he offered everyone. "And you must be one of the Abbotts." "Nettie Abbott," she said. "I am 10 years old. I can read and do sums, and I am learning to cook." "That is impressive," Monroe said, and he said it as though he meant it, without the condescending warmth that adults so often used with children, as though children were amusing but not quite real. Nettie seemed to decide something behind her eyes. She looked at Eudora, then back at Monroe, and then she very deliberately turned to help the customer approaching the other end of the table, leaving Eudora and Monroe in what was as close to privacy as a busy Saturday market allowed. "You are doing this alone," Monroe said. It was not quite a question. Eudora kept her hands busy straightening jars. "I have plenty of help. The community here is good." "That is not what I meant." She looked up at him then. "I know what you meant, Mr. Sutton, and yes, I am. And before you offer condolences or sympathy or any of the usual observations people make, I will tell you that we are managing very well and the children are thriving." He considered this. "I was not going to offer condolences," he said. "I was going to say that it takes a particular kind of person to choose something that hard." She did not have an answer for that. It surprised her, and things that surprised Eudora Abbott were rarer than they used to be. Monroe Sutton bought a third jar of preserves, touched his hat, and went about his errands. But he came back twice more that day before the market closed, once to buy a small pot of dried sage from her table, and once for no apparent reason except to stand nearby and watch the market wind down, close enough that when she began folding her cloth, he stepped in without being asked, and helped her carry her crates to the wagon she had borrowed from the livery. He did not say much during this. He did not need to. There was a comfortable quality to his silence that she had not encountered in many people, the sense that he was not filling the air with words to manage his own discomfort, but simply being present, which was its own kind of language. "Thank you," she said when the crates were loaded. "My pleasure, Miss Abbott," he said, and stood back as she climbed up to the wagon seat. She drove home with Nettie beside her and Samuel in the wagon bed and Rosie asleep in the crate of empty jars. And she did not say anything about Monroe Sutton, but Nettie looked at her sideways twice with an expression that suggested the girl knew more than she was letting on. That evening, after the children were in bed, Eudora sat at the kitchen table with her mending and allowed herself, just for a moment, to think about it. He was a trail cowboy. He would be gone in 2 days. He would push his cattle north and she would never see him again, and that was simply the arithmetic of the situation, and there was no point in feeling anything about it. She did anyway. The third morning, she was in the garden pulling late-season turnips when she heard boots on the path and looked up to find Monroe Sutton standing at the garden gate with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized as the expression of a man who has decided to do something and is not entirely certain how it will be received. "Mr. Sutton," she said, sitting back on her heels in the dirt. "Miss Abbott." He turned his hat in his hand slowly. "I apologize for coming to your home. If this is unwelcome, I will go without any further intrusion." "It is not unwelcome," she said, because it was not, "but it is unexpected." He nodded. "I am leaving tomorrow morning. The cattle need to reach Abilene before the cold sets in proper." He paused. "I wanted to say something before I went." "Then say it," she said. She was not given to making things easier than they needed to be, but she was not given to making them harder either. "I have driven cattle on the Kisham Trail for 7 years, Monroe said. "I have been through Caldwell 30-odd times. I have never wanted to stop before." He looked at her steadily. "I want to stop." Eudora stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She was aware that her hair had come half loose from its pins and that she had earth on her hands and probably on her face, and she thought briefly that this was not how a woman was supposed to receive a declaration of interest, and then she thought that she did not much care. "There are things you should know," she said, "before anything else." "Tell me," he said simply. "Those children are not mine by blood. They were my brother's children." He and his wife are both gone, and I have been raising them for 3 years, and I intend to raise them until they are grown. They are not a circumstance I am managing. They are my family. Whoever comes into my life comes into theirs." Monroe Sutton looked at her for a long, level moment, and then he said, "All of you," she blinked. "I beg your pardon. I meant to say if you would allow me to come back through Caldwell and perhaps to write letters in the meantime, and to see whether whatever this is between us is as real as it feels, I would not be coming back for just you, Miss Abbott. I would be coming back for all of you." He put his hat on, settling it with a slight tilt. "I am not a man who does things by halves." Eudora Abbott, who had kept herself steady through grief and poverty and exhaustion and loneliness for 3 years, felt something shift in her chest like a door opening onto unexpected sunlight. "You may write," she said, "and you may come back." He smiled that slow, whole-face smile. "Then I will." He was gone the next morning before dawn, and Caldwell settled back into its ordinary rhythms, and Eudora told herself it might come to nothing, that trail cowboys made promises the way spring made promises, real enough in the moment, difficult to keep through all the seasons. But the first letter arrived in November. It was written in a careful, slightly uneven hand on good paper, postmarked from Abilene, Kansas. It was not a flowery letter. Monroe Sutton did not write in the elaborate romantic style that Eudora had read in the novels that circulated among the women of Caldwell. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly, directly, with a careful attention to honesty. He described the cattle arriving in Abilene and the stockyard negotiations, and the long ride back south. He described the country he moved through, the flat sweep of the Kansas grassland, the smell of snow coming off the north wind, the particular quiet of the prairie at night that some men found lonely and he had always found peaceful. He asked after the children by name, Nettie and Samuel and Rosie, and he asked after Eudora herself, not just her circumstances but her thoughts, what she was reading if she was reading anything, what she thought about the new county commissioner who had been causing controversy in the regional papers. Eudora read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then she put it away in the drawer beneath her Bible, and then she took it out and read it again. She wrote back that same evening. She told him about the children, Samuel's ongoing war with arithmetic, and his natural genius for anything involving horses, Nettie's increasing skill at the market and her recent friendship with the preacher's daughter, Rosie's new word which was, furthermore, pronounced with absolute conviction, but applied to situations that did not require it. She told him about the early frost that had taken the last of her garden, and the way the town was talking about the new railroad extension and what it might mean for Caldwell's future. She told him that she had been reading a collection of speeches by Frederick Douglass that she had borrowed from the school teacher, and she found herself more stirred by them than she had anticipated, and she was thinking carefully about what it meant to talk about freedom in a country that still argued over who deserved it and who did not. She hesitated over that last part, then left it in. If Monroe Sutton was going to be put off by a woman who thought about things, then she needed to know that now rather than later. He was not put off. His reply came in December and engaged with her thoughts about Douglass with a seriousness and a thoughtfulness that surprised and pleased her, and then surprised her again that she was surprised, because he had given her no reason to think him shallow. He wrote, "I have ridden alongside men of every background on the trail. I have eaten beside black cowboys who knew this land better than any of us and were paid less and respected less for the knowing of it. I have always thought this a particular kind of wrong that people convince themselves is ordinary. I am glad you are reading things that make you think hard." She kept every letter in the drawer beneath her Bible. By February, the stack was an inch thick. The children knew something was happening because children always know. Samuel asked once carefully while she was stirring oatmeal one morning, "Is Mr. Sutton going to come back?" And she said yes, she believed he was. Samuel nodded with the gravity of a small statesman and said, "Good. He did not make fun of my hat." Nettie said nothing directly, but she helped Eudora clean the house with unusual thoroughness the week Eudora mentioned in a letter that Monroe had said he expected to be in Caldwell by late March. And the girl applied herself to the windows with a ferocity that left them sparkling. Rosie, who was now almost 5 and had developed opinions about most things, had decided from the stories Eudora occasionally told that Monroe Sutton was connected in some way to horses. And since Rosie considered horses to be among the finest things in existence, she was broadly in favor of his return. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of March 1882, and Eudora was not watching the street because she refused to be the kind of woman who watched the street. But she happened to be at the window adjusting a curtain when she saw him ride in, and her heart did something immediate and entirely undignified that she chose to simply accept. She met him at the door before he could knock, because Rosie had seen him from the window first and announced his arrival at high volume, and there had been a brief stampede of small feet that resulted in all 3 children crowding the doorway as Eudora worked to restore some order. Monroe stood on the porch with his hat off and a look of genuine delight at the chaos in front of him. He looked rested and clear-eyed, the winter months having done something good for him. He had the look of a man who had spent some part of the cold season actually sleeping and eating properly. "Mr. Sutton," Eudora managed, over Rosie's determined attempts to see his horse. "Miss Abbott." He looked at the children, then at her, and the warmth in his expression was the same warmth that had been in every letter, steady, real, without performance. "I said I would come back." "You did," she agreed. He came in for supper that evening, and it was the kind of supper that Eudora would remember for the rest of her life, not because anything particularly dramatic happened, but because of how natural it was. Monroe sat at her kitchen table and helped Samuel with his arithmetic, which he turned out to be reasonably good at, and he listened to Nettie talk about the book she had just finished with the same focused attention he gave to everything, and he bounced Rosie on his knee when she demanded it without any of the awkward discomfort that men sometimes showed around small children. He stayed 3 days, sleeping at the boarding house on the main street, calling on Eudora in the mornings and spending the evenings with the family. They walked the length of Caldwell together on the Saturday, the children ranging ahead of them like a small flock of birds, and Monroe told her about his plans. He had been thinking, he said, about whether the trail driving life still made sense for him, whether there was another way of doing things. "I have some money saved," he said. "Enough to make a real start on something. My father had a piece of land in the Texas Panhandle. When he died 3 years ago, he left it to me. I have been leasing it out for grazing, but the man who was leasing it is moving on, and I have been thinking about what to do with it." "What kind of land?" Eudora asked. "Good land," he said. "Flat and grassy and well-watered. A creek runs through the south quarter. There is an existing house, small but sound, and a barn that needs some repair. It is not much yet, but it could be." He paused. "I have been thinking about cattle of my own, a proper operation instead of the trail, something that stays in one place." Eudora looked at him sideways. "You are describing settling down." "I am," he said, meeting her gaze, "for the right reasons." They were standing at the edge of the main street where it gave way to the open prairie, and the afternoon light was long and golden, and the wind was gentle. And Rosie had caught hold of Monroe's hand, because she had spotted a prairie dog near its burrow and wanted him to see it too. He looked down at Rosie with an expression of soft amusement, and then he looked at Eudora, and she saw in his face the thing that the letters had been telling her for months, that this was not casual, that Monroe Sutton had decided about this in the same quiet, deliberate way he decided about everything, and that the decision was about her and about the children with equal weight. "I want to ask you something," he said, "but not today. I want you to know me better before I ask, and I want to know you better, and I want to be certain it is what you want and not just what you need. Those are different things." "They are," she agreed, and the fact that he understood the difference was itself a kind of answer. He left on a Monday, heading back toward Texas to see to his land and his plans, and he promised to be back before summer's end. He shook Samuel's hand and ruffled his hair, which Samuel bore with dignity. He told Nettie that he had brought her a book from a bookseller in Abilene, a proper novel, not a primer, and watched her face light up with a satisfaction that was genuine and warm. He picked up Rosie, who had her arms extended toward him before he had finished his goodbyes, and let her hug him with her full 5-year-old fierceness. And when he set her down, there was something in his eyes that Eudora could only describe as already belonging. He shook Eudora's hand at the door because there were neighbors watching, and then he held it a moment longer than a handshake required and looked at her directly. "I will write tomorrow," he said. "I know you will," she said. He did. The letters that spring were different from the autumn ones. There was more between the lines now, more of both of them visible in the words. He told her about the Texas Panhandle, the grassland stretching to the horizon, the creek that would be good for a kitchen garden, and a small irrigation channel for vegetables, the house that he was working to repair and extend with the help of 2 hired men. He told her about the barn raising he organized with a neighboring ranching family, the Ray's family who had worked the land there for 2 generations and knew it better than almost anyone. And he described Diego Ray's teaching him a water management technique that turned out to make the South pasture substantially more productive. She told him about the spring market and Nettie's growing reputation for the best blackberry preserves in Caldwell now that she had taken over most of that work. She told him about Samuel's horse obsession, which had reached the point where the livery owner, an older man named Herb Calloway, had begun letting Samuel come by after school to help with grooming, not because he needed the help, but because Samuel's feeling for horses was obvious and real, and Herb recognized it for what it was. She told him about Rosie's first day of school, which had been a triumph of personality. The girl had walked in, introduced herself to the teacher and all of the children in the class, and sat down as though she had been doing it for years. She told him other things too. She told him about the evenings when the loneliness of her situation pressed in harder than usual, when she would sit with the mending after the children were in bed and feel the weight of all the responsibility she carried alone, and then feel guilty for feeling it because the children were worth every ounce of that weight. She told him about the particular grief of raising other people's children, the way she sometimes caught Nettie looking at a drawing she had made of her mother's face, and how Eudora had learned not to speak into those moments, but simply to sit nearby, to be present without intruding. Monroe wrote back, "You understand something that not everyone does, which is that love and grief are not opposites. They run together in the same current. I think you are giving those children something remarkable, which is a person who holds both without pretending one away." She read that letter 4 times. He arrived back in Caldwell in late July, earlier than he had promised, which she discovered when she opened her door one Tuesday morning and found him standing there with his hat in his hand and a look of barely contained intention. "You are early," she said. "I finished what I needed to finish," he said. "And then I was here, simple as that." It was a hot July, the kind of Kansas summer that baked the earth and made the air shimmer over the grass and turned every breeze into a mercy. They spent a week in each other's company, easier now, more familiar, the careful politeness of early acquaintance having burned away into something more genuine. He fixed the loose shutter on her north window without being asked, and found the axle problem on her borrowed wagon and corrected it. She cooked for him with the same lack of ceremony she cooked for the children, and he ate with undisguised appreciation and helped with the dishes, which surprised her. "Where did a Texas Trail cowboy learn to wash dishes?" she asked. "My mother died when I was 12, he said, stacking the plates with practiced efficiency. "My father was a good man but an impractical one. I learned to do most things." She had not known this. She filed it away alongside all the other things she had learned about him, that he was methodical about his horses but impulsive about books, buying them whenever he encountered them and reading them in no particular order. That he had no patience for meanness but enormous patience for difficulty. That he was quietly, consistently generous in the way that people were generous who had grown up without excess and understood what it meant to need something. On the fourth evening of that visit, they sat on her porch after the children were in bed. The sky was enormous and dark and full of stars, and the town was settled into its nighttime quiet with only the distant sound of the saloon on the far end of the street, a reminder that the world contained other people. Monroe was quiet for a long time, and she let the quiet sit because she had learned that his silences meant thinking, not absence. "Eudora," he said finally. It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you now," he said. "I have known you long enough and I know my own mind. But I need to say the whole of it, not just part of it, because I think you deserve the whole of it." "Then say it," she said, the same words she had said to him at the beginning at the garden gate, and she saw from his expression that he remembered. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to bring those children and come with me to the Panhandle, and I want to build something real there with all of you. I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to bring it all, everything you are, every obligation and responsibility and love you carry, and add mine to it." He paused. "I know what I am asking. It is not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." "I also know," he said carefully, "that you have built something here, your market and your community and the life you have made. I would not want you to feel that you are leaving yourself behind in order to go forward. I have thought about that. If you wanted to stay in Caldwell, I could find a way to build something here instead. My land in Texas is a preference, not a requirement." Eudora looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright. "The Panhandle," she said. "Tell me about it again." He told her, and she listened. And what she heard was not just land and grass and water. She heard the way his voice changed when he talked about it, the quiet certainty of a man describing his home, or what he intended to be his home, and the way it had enough room in it, the description, for 4 people who were not yet there but were already imagined into the landscape. "The children would need a proper school," she said. "There is one in the nearest town, 6 miles. We would need a good wagon and a reliable team. Samuel would want to be involved with the horses. He could start learning properly. There is more than enough for him to do. Nettie will want to keep up her reading and her studies. We can afford books, and I know of a lending library in the county seat." Rosie she did not worry about. Rosie would adapt to any circumstances with the cheerful determination she applied to everything. "I need to know one more thing," Eudora said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, not kindly." "I always answer honestly," Monroe said. "Those children have already lost both their parents. They have built a life with me. If you and I marry, you become real to them in a way that carries weight and can cause hurt. I need to know that you understand that. That you are not coming into this with good intentions that will soften when it gets hard. Because children can tell the difference, and it will break something in them that cannot be easily fixed." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I watched my father do a thing that I have thought about my whole adult life. After my mother died, he brought a woman home who was perfectly kind to him and perfectly indifferent to me. Not cruel, just absent. And I grew up knowing the exact shape of that indifference, how big a space it takes up. I would not do that to a child. I would not do it to your children." He looked at her steadily. "I said all of you. I meant it the first time, and I mean it now." Eudora Abbott, who had been self-sufficient and careful and guarded for 3 years, felt the last of the careful guarding give way. "Yes," she said. Monroe let out a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it since October. Then he smiled, the full, slow smile that she had been cataloging in her memory since the first time she saw it. "Yes," she said again, and this time she was smiling too. They were married in October 1882 in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, which was a simpler ceremony than either of them would perhaps have had under different circumstances, but which suited them both perfectly. Eudora wore her best dress in deep blue wool, and had flowers in her hair that Nettie had arranged with great seriousness that morning. Monroe wore a clean suit that he had acquired in Abilene, and a look of absolute, unguarded happiness that the preacher's wife later declared was one of the most moving things she had seen at the altar in 15 years. The children were at the front of the small congregation. Nettie sat straight-backed and bright-eyed, and Samuel wore his good trousers without complaint, and Rosie, who had been told she could carry a small bunch of flowers as part of the ceremony, took this responsibility so seriously that she processed down the aisle at a funeral pace, while everyone in the church struggled to maintain appropriate expressions. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the community hall put on by the women of Caldwell, because Eudora had been a neighbor and a friend to many of them for 4 years, and they wanted to send her off properly. There was dancing, fiddle music, and a caller who knew his business, and Monroe danced with Eudora in a way that made clear he had actually done this before, not the shuffling reluctance of a man dragged to the floor, but the easy movement of someone who had grown up in a community where dancing was a regular pleasure. He danced with Nettie too, very formally, and she stood on his feet the way small children do, and pronounced it excellent. He danced with Rosie, which was less dancing and more spinning until she shrieked with laughter. Samuel declined to dance on the grounds that he was 8 years old and had his dignity to consider, but he ate 2 slices of cake and watched Monroe with an expression that was halfway to something it would take him a little longer to fully reach. They left for Texas 3 weeks later, in early November, with a solid wagon and a good team of horses, their household belongings packed carefully, and the children bundled under quilts for the long, cold journey south. Herb Calloway, the livery owner, came to see them off and pressed Samuel's hand and told him to keep up his horsemanship, and Samuel promised with a gravity that made the old man's eyes shine. The journey took 9 days, stopping each night with varying degrees of comfort at way stations, and one night at a ranch where the family took them in with the generous hospitality that was one of the genuine graces of the frontier, understanding that travelers in that country depended on each other. The Panhandle in November was raw and wind-scoured, the grass brown and the sky a deep cold blue, and when they first came in sight of the Sutton property along the creek, the small white house and the solidly rebuilt barn and the corral Monroe had put in that summer, Eudora felt something she did not immediately have words for, and then she understood it was the particular feeling of arrival. Not the arrival of someone coming home to a place they already knew, but the arrival of someone recognizing home in a place they have never been before. "There it is," Monroe said beside her on the wagon seat. "There it is," she agreed. Rosie, who had been sleeping under the quilt, chose this moment to sit up and look at the landscape with sleep-dazed eyes, and then said, very seriously, "Furthermore," which was apparently her assessment of the Texas Panhandle, and Monroe laughed, a real, full laugh that Eudora had been waiting to hear for a year. The house was indeed small, but Monroe had done what he promised. He had extended it over the summer. A new room off the back for the children, additional storage, and a proper pantry. A good kitchen range that was a significant upgrade from the one in her Caldwell house. The barn was tight and clean, and there were already 4 horses in the corral and a small flock of chickens in the yard. Samuel was out of the wagon before it had properly stopped, moving toward the horses with the focused delight of a child encountering precisely the world he has been wanting. Monroe watched him go and said quietly to Eudora, "I told Diego Reyes his boy could come by on Saturdays and ride with Samuel. I thought they would get on." Diego Reyes' son was named Tomás, and he was 10 years old and had been on a horse since he could walk, and he and Samuel became inseparable within about 2 weeks of meeting, which was good for Samuel's horsemanship and good for his sense of the landscape and its people. The Reyes family had been ranching in the Panhandle before the area was formally organized, and their knowledge of the land and its water and its weather was practical and hard one, and they shared it freely with their neighbors. Eudora visited with Maria Reyes, Diego's wife, who was a compact, energetic woman of about 40 with 7 children and opinions about everything, and they became friends of the immediate, practical kind women who recognized in each other someone useful and interesting. Maria showed Eudora the specific difficulties of the panhandle soil, different from Kansas, and the way the wind patterns affected planting seasons, and which water sources were reliable through a dry summer and which were not. The first winter on the ranch was hard. The wind off the flat grassland was relentless, and the cold was drier and sharper than Kansas cold, and the isolation was more real 6 miles to town on a good day, longer when the weather closed in. But there was also the specific pleasure of being inside a warm house in that kind of cold, all 5 of them together, with the lamp burning, and the range throwing heat and Monroe reading aloud from whatever book they had on hand while Eudora sewed and the children did their lessons or played. Monroe was a good reader. He read with expression and pacing, never flatly, and he chose good material. He had a natural instinct for what would hold everyone's attention. He read Nettie novels and Samuel adventure stories and Rosie anything with animals in it. And on the evenings when the children were in bed, he read to Eudora from things they both wanted to think about, history and politics, and on one occasion, a long technical piece about irrigation engineering that turned out to be genuinely fascinating. There was a school in the nearby town of Cimarron Flats, Modest, taught by a young woman named Miss Perkins who had come from Ohio, and who turned out to be an excellent teacher with the particular combination of warmth and standards that made children want to learn. The children attended 4 days a week. On Fridays, Eudora taught them at home, which allowed her to supplement the curriculum and to address the specific things each child needed. Monroe threw himself into the ranch with the purposeful energy of a man who had been moving toward a stationary life for years, and found that it suited him better than any life he had imagined could. He was methodical and patient, learning the specific rhythms of a permanent operation, the difference between managing cattle on a trail drive and managing a breeding herd on your own land, the planning required for feed and water through a harsh season, the careful economics of a working ranch that has to sustain itself across years. He hired 2 permanent hands, a man named Webb, who was experienced and taciturn, and a younger man named Aurelio, who was 18 and strong and had come up from the Rio Grande Valley looking for work, and had found this job through the Ray's family connection. Monroe paid both men fair wages and treated them as the skilled workers they were, and the ranch functioned well. But what Monroe was, in the evenings and the mornings, and all the hours he was not actively working the cattle operation, was present. This was the word Eudora returned to most often when she thought about the first year on the ranch. He was present in a way that she had not known was possible in a person who also had the weight of a working enterprise on his shoulders. He knew where each child was and what they needed and what they were struggling with, not in an abstract parental way, but specifically, individually. He knew that Nettie was having trouble with the older girls at the Cimarron Flats school who had decided she was strange because she read too much, and he talked to her about it with directness and humor and the specific comfort of someone who had also been the unusual one in a room. He knew that Samuel's feelings about his parents had shifted as he got older into something more complicated and grief-laden than the simple sadness of a small child, and he did not try to fix this but sat with it, letting Samuel talk on the evenings when the boy needed to. He made room. That was the thing. Wherever there was a need, Monroe Sutton made room for it without complaint or resentment, and this was perhaps the most remarkable thing Eudora had ever witnessed in another person. She was very much in love with him by the spring of their first year on the ranch, though she had been in love with him longer than that and had simply been careful about naming it. One evening in April, when the grass was coming in green along the creek and the air smelled of new growth, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a panhandle evening, she said so. They were walking along the creek bank, the first time they had managed to be alone together for more than a few minutes in what felt like weeks, and the evening was quiet and the water was running clear, and Monroe had been talking about the spring calves with the enthusiasm he brought to all things that were going well, and she stopped walking and looked at him and said, "I love you." He stopped. He looked at her the way he looked at things he wanted to understand fully. "I have been in love with you for a long time," she said, because she was not a woman who said things by halves either. "Since probably the winter, if I am being honest. Maybe before." Monroe was quiet for a moment, and then he took a step toward her and put his hand along the side of her face and tilted her face toward his, and he kissed her in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for permission and is grateful for it, not quickly, not tentatively, but with the same thoroughness and steadiness he applied to everything in his life. "I have loved you since the Saturday market," he said, when they had a moment's breath. "Since you told me your prices were fair and looked at me like I had said something almost right but not quite," she laughed. "You had." He kissed her again, and the creek ran by them and the evening settled around them, and somewhere up at the house Rosie could be heard demanding someone's attention in carrying tones, and they walked back together through the green April grass with their hands linked, and the particular lightness of people who have named something true. The first anniversary of their marriage came, and then the second, and the ranch grew, and the children grew, and the family that had come together from grief and necessity and deliberate choice settled into itself with the deep-rooted ease of something that was always supposed to be there. Nettie turned 14 and then 15, and the difficulty with the Cimarron Flats girls resolved itself, as school always eventually does, with the growing up of everyone involved and the shuffling of alliances and the slow realization that being interesting is better than being unremarkable. Nettie grew into a young woman of considerable capability and even more considerable opinion, and she helped Eudora run the household accounts and develop the kitchen garden into a genuine kitchen enterprise that provided both for the family and for the occasional sale in town. Samuel turned 11 and 12, and his relationship with horses deepened into something that was clearly going to be the central work of his life. Monroe recognized this and did not try to redirect it, but instead invested in it, hiring a man who trained horses professionally to come out to the ranch for 2 weeks one summer and work with Samuel on the specific techniques of starting young horses. The language of it, the patience of it, the understanding of equine psychology that turned a dangerous animal into a reliable partner. Samuel absorbed this with an intensity that reminded Eudora of the way certain plants take the first rain of spring, drinking it all in immediately, visibly transformed. Rosie turned 6 and then 7, and was exactly what everyone who had known her as a small child would have predicted: loud, curious, affectionate, funny, absolutely certain of her own judgment, and possessed of an ability to make friends instantly with any person or animal she encountered. She was also, beneath all of this, remarkably observant. She saw things in people that they had not said, and responded to them in ways that were startlingly apt for a child her age. In the 3rd year on the ranch, something changed between Eudora and Monroe in the particular way things change when two people have been building trust long enough that the building becomes the structure itself. The early electricity of new love had not faded. It had deepened into something more complex and more nourishing, the love of people who have seen each other through difficult things and come out trusting each other more because of it. That trust was tested in the winter of that 3rd year, when the cattle operation hit a hard season. An ice storm in January damaged the barn significantly, and they lost 7 head of cattle to the cold and the injury of the storm, a real financial blow. Monroe was tight-lipped and tense in a way she had not seen in him before, working 14-hour days to repair the barn and manage the remaining herd, coming in at night exhausted and quiet. Eudora did not try to minimize the problem. She sat down with the account books and worked through the numbers with the same clear-eyed thoroughness she brought to everything, and she found 3 places where they could cut costs and 2 potential sources of additional income That spring, selling 2 of the young horses, Samuel had been training with Monroe's support and expanding the kitchen garden sale into a contract with the hotel in the county seat, which had been rebuilt the previous year, and was looking for reliable local suppliers of produce and preserved goods. She laid this out for Monroe one evening at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. He read through her figures without speaking, and then he looked up at her with an expression of such complete gratitude and partnership that she felt it physically, the warmth of being genuinely seen as capable by someone whose opinion meant something. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Those are the same thing in you," he said, "and I mean it as the finest compliment." They came through the winter, and the spring was better than they had feared, and by summer the accounts were stable again, and the barn was repaired, and 2 of Samuel's trained horses sold at a price that surprised even Monroe. In the spring of their 4th year on the ranch, Eudora told Monroe that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the children were up, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee, watching his face as she said it. His expression moved through several things rapidly: surprise first, and then something that was almost wonder, and then the pure, uncomplicated joy of a man receiving news he had hoped for and not quite dared to count on. He came around the table and took her hands and held them, and he did not say anything for a moment because he was apparently not in possession of words, which was unusual enough for Monroe that she found it deeply endearing. "Are you well?" he managed finally. "I am very well," she said. "It is early yet, but I am certain." He kissed her hands. He kissed her forehead. He sat back down and picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. And then he laughed, that full, real laugh that she loved. The children were told at supper, and the responses were characteristic. Nettie was immediately practical, talking about where the cradle would go and what supplies would be needed. Samuel looked thoughtful in the way he looked thoughtful about important things, and then said, seriously, "I have been thinking I would like to be a better brother than I was before, since I was only 8 when Rosie was small." Monroe told him that he had been an excellent brother at 8, and the new baby was lucky. Samuel accepted this with dignity. Rosie, who was 7 and not accustomed to being displaced as the youngest, was quiet for a moment, and then she stood up from the table and came to sit in Eudora's lap, which she had not done in over a year, and put her small head against Eudora's shoulder, and Eudora held her and understood. "You will always be mine," Eudora said quietly, for Rosie's ears only. "Nothing changes that, not ever." Rosie did not say anything, but she pressed closer, and after a little while she went back to her supper with the usual confidence restored. The pregnancy proceeded well through the summer and into the autumn. Eudora worked steadily through it. She was not a woman who took to her chair when she was healthy and capable, and the ranch needed what it needed, but Monroe managed the balance between her capability and her needs with a delicacy and practical intelligence that she valued enormously. He hired a neighbor girl to come in and help with the heavier household work. He made sure she rested in the afternoons, not by telling her to, but by the simple strategy of sitting down himself with a book in the way that made it easy for her to stop without feeling she was being managed. Maria Reyes was the one she talked to most about the practical aspects of childbirth on the frontier. Maria had 7 children and had delivered 4 of them without a physician anywhere nearby, and she was matter-of-fact and knowledgeable and not inclined to alarm. "Your body knows what to do," Maria said. "It is the mind that needs to be confident." There was also a midwife in Cimarron Flats, a woman named Agnes who had been at 30-odd births in the area and was competent and calm, and who Eudora liked from their first meeting. The baby came in late November, the same month Eudora had arrived on the ranch 3 years before, which she later thought of as fitting. The labor was long but not frightening, and Agnes was steady throughout, and Monroe stayed as close as he was permitted, and was available immediately when Eudora wanted to grip his hand so hard. She was briefly concerned about the bones of his fingers. He did not complain about his fingers. The baby was a boy. He was large and dark-haired and had Monroe's brown eyes from the first moment, and he arrived into the world already looking as though he had considered his options and found this acceptable. Monroe held him with the practiced ease of a man who had been holding other people's children for 3 years, and with something additional underneath that ease, a particular tenderness, fierce and soft at the same time, that Eudora would remember for the rest of her life. "What do we call him?" Monroe said. They had discussed names but not decided, and they had agreed they would know when they saw him. Eudora looked at her son, the word fitting perfectly and completely, and said, "Thomas Monroe Sutton." Monroe looked at her. "After my brother," she said, "who would have wanted to know you," she paused, "and after his uncle." Monroe kissed her forehead very gently and did not say anything for a long moment. "Thomas Monroe Sutton," he said. "That is a good name." When the children were brought in, Nettie first, then Samuel, then Rosie, held up by Samuel to see over the edge of the bed, the baby was awake and regarding the world with the wide-eyed gravity of the very new. Nettie touched his hand with one careful finger and smiled in a way that was entirely private, a girl becoming something new herself in that moment. Samuel looked at his nephew, for so the boy would be, in every sense that mattered, and nodded as though confirming a decision. Rosie, from her elevated position in Samuel's arms, leaned in very close and said with great authority, "Hello, I am Rosie. I am the best at hugs. Furthermore." Everyone in the room laughed, even Monroe, even Agnes the midwife, even Eudora, though it cost her something in her current condition. Thomas Monroe Sutton looked at the people looking at him and blinked very slowly, which was clearly his agreement to the arrangement. That winter, the ranch house was full in a way it had not been before, fuller even than before the baby, because something had shifted. Eudora noticed it in the way the house felt in the evenings, the particular quality of warm and settled that comes not from things being easy, but from people being genuinely, willingly committed to one another. Monroe reading to the older children while she nursed the baby. Samuel and Tamaz raised out in the barn every Saturday working the young horses in the cold, their breath making clouds in the dim winter air. Nettie at the kitchen table with her accounts and her novels, growing into something formidable and real. Rosie, with her new little brother to adore, which she did with the same full-throttle energy she applied to everything. In the spring, Monroe took Samuel to a horse auction in the county seat and let him choose. Samuel chose a 5-year-old bay gelding that no one else at the auction wanted because the horse had a bad reputation for difficulty. And Samuel spent 4 months working with that horse with a patience and instinct that astonished everyone who saw it. The horse became, by summer, one of the finest working animals on the ranch, and Monroe told Samuel that he could call it his own, which was the first horse Samuel had that was formally his, and it was called Chester, which was Samuel's choice, because Samuel had decided the horse looked like a Chester, and no one could argue with that. Nettie, at 15, had decided she wanted more formal education. She had talked about this carefully, in the way she did things, thinking it through before speaking, presenting her case when she was ready. There was a female seminary in the city of Wichita, she said, which had been operating for some years and which offered a proper course of education for young women. She had written to them and received information. The cost was significant but not impossible. Monroe and Eudora talked about this together for several evenings after the children were in bed. Eudora wanted Nettie to have what she wanted. Monroe was equally clear on this. The practical question was the money, and they went through the accounts the way they always did together, honestly, looking at what was possible. It was possible. Not easily, but possible. They would need to sell one of the horses from the current crop of trained young animals, which Samuel agreed to without any difficulty when the reason was explained. The Ray's family, who had a daughter 2 years older than Nettie who had been working as a seamstress in Wichita for the past year, provided contact information for a respectable boarding house near the seminary where Nettie could stay safely. Nettie left for Wichita in the fall of that year, and Eudora stood in the yard and watched the wagon take her down the road and did not cry until she was back inside. And then she cried quite a lot, and Monroe sat beside her and did not try to make her stop but simply stayed. "She is going to be magnificent," Monroe said. "I know she is," Eudora said, which was true, and which somehow made the missing her harder rather than easier. Nettie wrote every week. She was excellent at the seminary, as they had expected, and she thrived in the environment of serious young women who wanted to learn things. And the letters home were full of ideas and arguments, and the particular excitement of a mind being given proper room to expand. She came home for the summer, and the house was full again in a different configuration, and baby Thomas, now walking, now talking in the explosive, enthusiastic way of toddlers who have discovered language, was added to Nettie's list of intense passions. The years built themselves one on another the way years do, and what accumulated was not just time but substance. The ranch grew steadily into something real, not the largest operation in the Panhandle, not the most prosperous, but solid and well-run and respected. Monroe had developed a reputation for the quality of his horses, which was substantially Samuel's doing as much as his own, and for the fair way he ran his operation, which attracted good men and kept them. By the time Thomas was 2 and walking everywhere at alarming speeds, Samuel was 13 and had the horse operation running in a way that Monroe increasingly stepped back from because Samuel simply knew more. This transition happened naturally, without any awkwardness, because Monroe was not a man whose sense of himself required being the most competent person in a room. On a warm evening in the summer that Thomas turned 2, Eudora sat on the porch of the house that had been extended twice now, and was large and comfortable and completely theirs, and watched the light go gold over the Texas grassland. Monroe came and sat beside her in the other chair, and they could hear inside the house the sound of Thomas's concentrated commentary on something and Rosie's answering laughter, and the comfortable domestic sounds of a house that was genuinely lived in. "I have been thinking about something," Monroe said. "You are always thinking about something," Eudora said. "I was thinking that we might consider whether you want to take on a larger kitchen enterprise. Diego mentioned that the hotel in the county seat has been looking for a more consistent supplier, and Maria said the contact she gave Nettie for the boarding house knows a buyer for preserved goods in Wichita who is looking for Panhandle suppliers." Eudora turned this over. Her kitchen garden had been expanding steadily, and the preserved goods she sold in Cimarron Flats had outgrown what the local market could absorb. She had been thinking about this herself. "That would require a larger cellar and at least one more hired woman," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was thinking about how to make that work." They talked through it the way they talked through everything practically, thoroughly, with equal weight given to each perspective. It was one of the things she loved most about her life with Monroe, this quality of true partnership. He never made decisions for her, never managed her or condescended to her. He consulted and collaborated, and then trusted her judgment, the same way she trusted his. The enterprise grew, and within a year Eudora Abbott Sutton's preserved goods were traveling north to Wichita on a regular supply contract, and the cellar under the house had been extended by Webb and Aurelio, who were still on the ranch and had become essentially part of the extended family of the place. And there was a woman named Perlina who came 3 days a week to help with the preserving, and who turned out to be the best baker Eudora had encountered in the Panhandle. And they added baked goods to the supply list, and the contract doubled. Nettie returned from the seminary in Wichita after 2 full years, which was the complete course, and she was 20 years old and someone to be reckoned with. She was not the same girl who had left, and she was also entirely the same girl, just more of herself, with more tools and more confidence and more knowledge to apply her natural capability to. She came home and spent 3 months on the ranch, and then announced that she had been corresponding with a law office in Abilene that was beginning to employ women as clerks and legal researchers, which was not common, but was happening in a few progressive firms, and she had been offered a position. Eudora sat across from her niece, her daughter, in every meaningful way, and looked at this young woman who had come to her at 7 years old with nothing but grief and the scraps of her former life, and felt something so large and complex that it took a moment to locate it, and when she did, she recognized it as the particular pride that belongs to parents who have done what they set out to do. "Go," Eudora said. Nettie's eyes shone. "You are certain." "I have never been more certain of anything," Eudora said. "You go and be what you are, Nettie. We will always be here." Monroe drove Nettie to the stagecoach station himself and carried her bags and shook her hand, and then, because he was Monroe and because Nettie was his, held her in a brief, fierce embrace that he released quickly, so that neither of them would have to manage excessive feeling in a public place. Nettie wrote from Abilene, and then from the wider world as she eventually moved on from that office to other things, and she wrote long, detailed, wonderful letters, and she came home for Christmas and for the occasional summer, and her life was hers in the fullest sense, and it was extraordinary. Thomas grew, and the ranch grew, and in the autumn of their 6th year on the ranch, Eudora found herself expecting again. She told Monroe in the morning again, and he was less surprised this time but no less moved, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen before the day began. This baby was a girl, born in the early spring when the first green was coming into the grass along the creek. She was small and fair-haired, unlike Thomas, and she had Eudora's gray eyes and a distinctly self-possessed quality from the moment of her arrival, as though she had assessed the situation and decided it would do. They named her Clara Rose Sutton, Clara for Thomas and Clara's mother, the woman who had held this family together before Eudora had, and Rose for Rosie, who was 9 years old and so honored by the gesture that she could not speak for a full minute, which was the longest Rosie had ever been silent in her entire life. "You named her after me," Rosie said finally. "After you," Eudora confirmed. "And after someone very important who you never got to know as well as you deserved to." Rosie held baby Clara with the careful, complete attention she gave to things that mattered most, and the baby looked up at her with the Eudora gray eyes, and something passed between them in that moment that you could see even if you could not name it. Samuel, 14 now and already as tall as Monroe was going to be, looked at his new sister, and then at Monroe with an expression of male bewilderment that contained, underneath it, something softer and more genuine. He was becoming a good young man, steady and hardworking, and kind in the deliberate way of someone who has thought about what kindness costs and decided it is worth the paying. There was a conversation that autumn between Monroe and Samuel that Eudora was not present for, but that Monroe told her about afterward. They had been out working with the horses, and the day had been long and good, and on the ride back to the barn Samuel had said without preamble, "I want to thank you." Monroe had asked what for. "For coming back," Samuel said. "For not being the kind of man who only meant part of what he said." Monroe had thought about this for a moment and then said, "I want you to know that I have thought of you as mine since before I had any right to, and I have never had a single day of regret about any of it." Samuel had nodded and said nothing more, because he was Samuel and some things were complete when they were said. But he had reached across from his horse to briefly grip Monroe's arm, the way men on horseback did, and Monroe had gripped back, and that had been the whole of it, which was plenty. Eudora, hearing this, sat quietly for a moment, and then she said, "He has needed to say that for a long time." "I know," Monroe said. "Thank you for hearing it the right way." "There was only one right way," Monroe said simply. The following Christmas, with Nettie home from Abilene and Samuel nearly 15 and Rosie 9, and full of Christmas morning energy, and Thomas 3, and equal in energy, if not in vocabulary, and baby Clara 8 months old, and regarding the proceedings from her place in Monroe's arms with the calm interest she brought to everything, Eudora stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at the whole of it. The house was warm. The tree Rosie and Samuel had dragged in from the creek bottom 3 days earlier was standing in the corner with candles and ribbons, and the painted ornaments that Nettie had made at the seminary 2 years ago. Monroe was sitting in the big chair with Clara on one knee, and Thomas pressed against his leg, asking for the story of the stable and the animals, which Monroe was telling with full dramatic investment. Rosie was at the table writing something with great concentration. A letter, probably. She was a devoted correspondent. Samuel was on the floor near the hearth with one of his horse books, reading with the focus he brought to anything about horses. Nettie appeared beside Eudora in the doorway, following her gaze, and they stood together for a moment looking at the room. "Do you remember," Nettie said quietly, "when we first came to your house in Caldwell, Samuel and Rosie and me?" "I was 7. I remember everything about that day," Eudora said. "I was frightened," Nettie said. "Not of you, of everything being different, of not knowing where we fit." "I know," Eudora said. "I figured it out quickly," Nettie said. "That you were not going to let us not fit, that you were going to make us fit because you were not the kind of person who let things remain wrong when she could change them." Eudora looked at her. Nettie was 20 years old and beautiful in the specific way of women who have cultivated themselves from the inside out, and she was looking at Monroe in the chair with the babies, and she was smiling. "He did the same thing," Nettie said. "He walked into our lives and made us fit into his, and he never once made it feel like a burden or a compromise. He just included us, all of us." "All of you," Eudora agreed softly. Monroe looked up at that moment, some instinct perhaps, or simply the practiced attentiveness of a man who knew his family, and met Eudora's eyes across the room. He smiled, the slow, whole-face smile that she had been falling in love with since a Saturday market in Caldwell, Kansas in 1881. She smiled back, and the room was warm, and the family was whole, and nothing was unresolved, and nothing was absent. And the prairie wind moved outside over the brown winter grass, and the stars over the Texas panhandle were as thick and bright as they had always been, indifferent to everything below and somehow also in the way of very large things, a kind of witness. In the spring of that year, they made the property legal. Monroe had always held the ranch land in his name, which was the way things were done and had not caused any practical problem. But he wanted Eudora's name on it too, on the deed, formally and permanently. He drove to the county seat himself and had the paperwork drawn up with the county recorder, who was mildly surprised but entirely accommodating, and he came home and put the document in front of Eudora at the kitchen table. "This is your land too," he said, formally and completely. She looked at the document, both names clear and legal. Eudora Abbott Sutton and Monroe James Sutton, joint holders of record. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I wanted to." She had built a life 3 times now, she thought. Once in her girlhood in Missouri, once in Caldwell, Kansas, and now here on the panhandle grassland with this man and these children. Each time she had built it from necessity and will, and the refusal to believe that difficulty was permanent. But this time was different from the other times, because this time she had not built alone. That was the thing she had not known she was waiting for, not rescue, not someone to solve her problems, but a partner, someone to stand beside her and look at the same horizon and build toward it with equal investment. Someone who had looked at everything she was carrying and said, without hesitation, "All of you." In the years that followed, the children became their fullest selves, which is what children do when they are loved well. Samuel, by the time he was 17, was running the horse operation at the ranch in ways that exceeded anything Monroe had imagined when he began it, and buyers came from 3 counties to acquire Samuel Abbott Sutton's trained animals. He took the Sutton name formally when he was 16, which was his own decision, made quietly and with great seriousness, and Monroe witnessed the paperwork with a steadiness and a fullness of feeling that did not need to be spoken to be completely understood. Rosie grew into the most sociable and socially perceptive person Eudora had ever known. She finished her schooling in Cimarron Flats and then spent a year with Nettie in Abilene, learning the legal clerking work that Nettie had mastered, and she was good at it, though it was not her true calling. Her true calling, it eventually became clear, was the management of people and situations, the instinctive reading of a room and a person, and a dynamic that made her extraordinary as a mediator and a coordinator. She ended up working for the county government, which was expanding and needed people who could manage competing interests and find workable compromises, and she was very good at it. Nettie eventually partnered with a woman attorney in Wichita, one of the first female attorneys in Kansas, a woman of fierce intelligence and enormous courage, and the work they did together over the following decades was of the kind that moved things, slowly but genuinely, toward something better. Nettie wrote about her work in long, detailed letters that Eudora kept in a special box, and she visited at Christmas and in the summer, and every time she came home the house felt like it had expanded to accommodate her, which it had. Thomas grew up knowing the ranch as his native element, absorbing it into himself the way children absorb the landscape of their childhoods, and he had Monroe's quietness and Eudora's practical intelligence, and his own specific quality, a kind of patience with growing things, with the long, slow work of cultivation that made him a natural rancher in the original sense. He was interested in the grass itself, in the management of land as a living thing that could be improved or degraded, which was an understanding that was not common in the era but was becoming important. Clara, the youngest, was her own weather system, as Maria Reyes observed once when watching her, at 6 years old, hold a negotiation with two bigger children about the allocation of a swing. She grew up knowing exactly what she was worth and unwilling to accept less, which was the best thing Eudora could imagine having given her. On the evening of Monroe and Eudora's 10th wedding anniversary, Monroe came home from a day of riding the fence line to find Eudora had prepared the kind of dinner they had at Christmas, the proper kind, the one that took all day and required the good plates. The children who were home that year, which was Thomas and Clara and Rosie who was visiting, had been recruited as assistants and had done their various tasks with varying degrees of competence and enthusiasm. Monroe came in the door and stopped, taking in the table and the food and the candles and his family arranged around the room in the various postures of people who have been doing important work, and he had an expression on his face that Eudora had seen at specific moments across the 10 years, at the birth of Thomas, at Samuel's formal adoption, at Nettie's graduation, the expression of a man encountering the fullness of his own life and recognizing it. "What is the occasion?" Monroe said, though he knew. 10 years, Eudora said. "Is that what it has been?" he said. "Are you going to tell me it has gone fast?" "No," he said. "I was going to say it feels exactly as long as 10 years should, which is to say long enough to be real and full and not so long that any of it has faded." He came to her and kissed her on the cheek and said quietly near her ear, "I would do every day of it again." "As would I," she said. "Every hard one and every good one." "There have been more good ones," Monroe said. "There have," she agreed. They ate supper together, all of them, with the particular ease of a family so practiced in each other's company that the meal had its own rhythm, conversations overlapping, Rosie making Thomas laugh with some story from the county office, Clara negotiating seconds with a thoroughness that Monroe observed with paternal amusement, Eudora at her end of the table watching all of it with the deep, settled warmth of a woman who is precisely where she intended to be. After supper, when the children had dispersed to their various evening occupations, Monroe and Eudora sat together on the porch in the October evening, the air carrying the first cool edge of autumn, the sky full of stars. It was the same sky, more or less, under which they had built everything. The Panhandle stars, which were more than stars, which were the witness and the backdrop and the quiet, enduring context of their life together. Monroe reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and the wind moved through the dry autumn grass with a sound like something being said softly, and the house behind them held the warmth of supper and family and 10 years of days that had been real. "What are you thinking?" Monroe said. "I am thinking," Eudora said, That when I was 26 years old and 3 children arrived at my door with nowhere to go, I thought about what was required and I said yes, and I had no idea what that yes was going to grow into. What did it grow into? He said. She looked at him. The man she had married. The man who had said all of you, meaning it completely, and had proved it every day since. Everything, she said. It grew into everything. The stars continued their patient presence overhead, and the wind continued its slow speech across the grass, and the ranch lay quiet around them in the way that places are quiet when they are lived in and loved. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of completion, the satisfied quiet of something that has become what it was always meant to be. Monroe brought her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, one and then another, in the deliberate way he had of making ordinary gestures mean exactly as much as they should. "All of you," he said again, the words he had said the first time at the garden gate in Caldwell, when everything had been beginning. "All of us," she answered, because now it was a different kind of all, bigger and fuller and more real than either of them had imagined standing at that gate, and she would not have changed a single day of the building of it. The October wind swept across the panhandle and the stars wheeled overhead, and the house behind them held its warmth, and Eudora Abbott Sutton sat beside Monroe James Sutton on the porch of everything they had made and felt, completely and without reservation, that this was a life.